Hello and welcome to our podcast, Intensities of Transverse Time. Today's podcast will be run by me, Ali Nguyen, Isabella Anzalotti, Helen Chavez, Autumn Naranjo, Hamad Al-Quintani, and Sebastian Ramirez. Ali and Isabella will be leading our first segment discussing how the group defines the approach that we just studied and how it connects to our theme of linear and transversal time. The next segment will be led by Helen and Autumn about how the approach we just studied provides a unique lens to the study of the past. Our final segment will be led by Ahmad and Sebastian about the things that are revealed through this approach that would otherwise be obfuscated in the study of history. These three segments will further demonstrate our knowledge of the approach along with our interpretation of C. Riley Norton's book, Black on Both Sides.
In this first segment, Ali and I will be discussing how our group defines the approach that we just studied with a focus on our theme of linear and transversal time. Prior to studying this approach, we placed the concept of race and gender identity in different categories. However, through the study of this approach, specifically C. Riley Norton's Black on Both Sides, we are able to situate blackness and transness in the same category, giving us a radical and innovative approach to the study of American history. A major claim that Norton makes in the introduction of the book is that transness is not just a state of being or an expression of gender identity, but rather a freedom practice and a point of transition in history. It can be easily forgotten that transgender identities are not limited to our modern society and have existed throughout history, especially during the antebellum period. By interpreting Norton's claims, we understand that if we examine history in a linear fashion, the idea that transgender identities existing in this time period could be left out in our study of history. However, if we learn to study history through a transversal timeline, we can recognize the transitions and fungibilities that existed throughout many points of history, including the relations between gender fluidity and race. This gender fluidity can be seen in the story of Mary Jones, which is introduced to us on page 59 of Norton's Black on Both Sides. This story was the first account of trans identity that we see in American history and is centered around a crime committed by Mary in 1836. Mary Jones had an encounter with a white man named Robert Haslam in which she stole his wallet, as she had done with other men she shared evenings with before. When she was caught and put on trial, she was ordered to wear the same clothing that she had worn on the night of the incident and was accused of tricking Haslam into believing that she was a woman. Her outward expression of gender identity ultimately resulted in immense ridicule even after she was sentenced, and images of the man monster depicting her as a male dressed as a woman that we can see on page 61 were put up in shops throughout the area. Furthermore, this gender fluidity highlights the lengths that slaves went to escape this institutionalized segregation and oppression by hiding and running away in plain sight, further demonstrating the mutability and elasticity of gender through fungibility and fugitivity. This story of Mary Jones also introduces the idea that transgender identities are not entirely modern and have been around a lot longer than our history lessons have led us to believe. Overall, we feel that it is important to look at stories like that of Mary Jones to further our understandings of history by stepping outside the linear timeline that we have become so accustomed to learning.
Studying the approach Black on Both Sides, we have learned about the way black slaves were being used as flesh figures for gynecology. C. Riley Norton claims on page 57 that captive flesh figures a critical genealogy for modern madness, as chattel persons gave rise to an understanding of gender as mutable and as amendable form of being. Given that undergendering of blackness is also the context for imagining gender as a subject of rearrangement, and also discusses how fungibility became a critical practice for blacks in the antebellum period. Due to this, black women would be tortured and forced to undergo such experimental use for their bodies. Although their bodies were used to explore the human anatomy, black women were not seen as sentient beings but had organs that were used to advance fields in science. The reality of medical schools in the United States and medical instructions predominantly rely on black cadavers. This is proven on page 48 when Harrier Washington conducted a study in 1933 and found many Southern medical schools still using only black cadavers for teaching anatomy. Washington also discusses about the theft of black flesh from cemeteries, mortuaries, and morgues. Yet these African were not seen as human beings, how can their organs be used to identify the revealings of our bodies? Snorton highlights the history of American gynecology is also the transitive history of chattel slavery in medicine, not firmly being locatable in the past or more properly in linear time. In today's society, we are not aware of black slaves being the reason to back up so much medical history in regards to gynecology. Black women aren't credited to being the explanation for all of these studies that have to do with the female anatomy. We assume that it has to all do with science, and we give credit to those who made these discoveries, and not those who suffered unwillingly. Snorton emphasizes the importance in knowing the history and to give a gateway to appreciation, and that black and trans history is not linear, but rather occurring in transversal time.
This is Sebastian, reflecting on segment 1 of how the group defines the approach we just studied. And I kind of defined it as a unseen liberation in our modern society because, we see transness through a very narrow lens, and this book really opens up the perspective for viewing transness as a mode of fungibility and fugitivity, right? Like we discussed earlier, that being able to maneuver through these phases of your life to liberate yourself, because slavery was such a cruel time that they really took any opportunity to maneuver out of there as an advantage. And that's something that's been around for so long, and only today in society have we really skewed our views that, this is some taboo idea, which it's not. And that's just kind of how I wanted to define and kind of summarize and reflect on the first question, how does the group define the approach we just studied? Whenever ready.
My name is Helen Chavez, and I'll be discussing segment 2 along with Autumn. Black on Both Sides provides a unique lens to the study of the past. As we established, the book claims that transness is not just a state of being or an expression of gender, but rather a practice and a freedom in which one can transcend. Black on Both Sides has a variety of material from the late 19th century, such as plantation medical records, fugitive slave narratives, and more contemporary accounts of black trans folks to demonstrate how race figures have experienced development when it comes to the topic of transness. Seeing blackness and transness and transitive states makes the readers draw parallels with how the events are in some ways interchangeable. In the first few chapters specifically, Snorton explores in greater depth the fungibility by teaching us how sex and gender relates to the practice of medicine and law. In relation to our theme, linear and transverse time, fungibility or interchangeability is with no clear origin and no point of arrival. Rather than being limited by binary thinking and intersections of race and gender, they have the potential to become spaces of mutability, freedom, and possibility. Because of this, we are able to draw these connections to the events Snorton brings about across space and time. For instance, one of the topics Snorton brings about is how slavery and the production of racialized gender provide the foundations for understanding gender as mutable. Ultimately, Black on Both Sides encouraged me to think of history as something that is living, and something we ought to have a relationship with, because from the parallels drawn from the text, it is evident that it's reoccurring.
Before studying this approach, I had an understanding that U.S. history was a linear concept that changed over time in a specific order. This linear concept of U.S. history does not take into consideration the possibility of events happening transversely. The history of the United States is not a sequence of events that can be fit into a timeline, but rather scattered and unpredictable events while having a lasting effect on the outcome. When you look at the history of the United States transversely, you would miss the big idea of fungibility. It's what led to the beginning of transness. This concept of fungibility means to take on a different role and conform in order to escape slavery, otherwise known as passing into another condition. You cannot distinguish when race and gender even started because they are not linear ideas. They are meant to be seen as sometimes disoriented because sexuality isn't as clear as we thought. Furthermore, we can't look at race and gender as separate concepts from each other. An individual's form is different from the moment they start existing.
Blackness and transitivity are parallel in their meaning in terms of what they are referencing. If transgender and transsexual history and culture depend only on linear, tangible, and visible concepts, then we have the right to question what has been omitted and published as part of history, and more importantly, what has not. After studying this approach, the lens of U.S. history needs to take on a more dynamic lens view instead of a linear.
This is Sebastian. I will be reviewing segment 2. The question associated is, how does the approach we just studied provide a unique lens to the study of the past? And this has kind of been repeated a couple times, but it's really evident that Snoren takes a unique perspective on the topic that most conventional thinking doesn't show or express. And it's her way of expressing the past is very graphic and quite disturbing, to really give us an understanding of ultimately what exactly happened, and not to sugarcoat anything or beat around the bush, and to be very clear and graphic as possible, so we can really feel within ourselves, emotionally, what do we feel from reading this, and why does it feel that way, so we can fix that negative emotion or whatever emotion you're feeling to make it a more positive emotion for today's society as a whole. And I think that's it's not something you see in many books, so it's really unique, and it was a very unique perspective that we all got to kind of discover together, and especially through class and lectures, it really cleared things up in some of the vocabulary used that was very unconventional, like fungibility and fugitivity. Fugitivity is kind of in our vocabulary, but in the sense that Snoren used it, it was really, like I said, a unique perspective on these words. So that's all I have for segment 2, and yeah.
Hi, this is Sebastian Ramirez, and I'll be doing segment 3 along with Hamad. So what is revealed through this approach that otherwise would be / is obfuscated and hazy in the study of history? What has been revealed through this approach that isn't part of conventional thinking is the notion that queerness and transness have been found for much longer than we assume. Along with the sheer context of what happened to slaves, to educate the reader about why a slave would take these actions, such as cross-dressing. It wasn't about personal expression or identity. It was about liberation and striving for freedom. Much of the context that the book gave us, much of the context this book gave of slaves' conditions were horrifying. The book elaborates on the white male using the slaves as an uninhabited appliance that they could use to study the human body at their disposal. How they would use long apparatuses and stick it in their rectum. The book gives graphics of this occurring and the tools used. The notion that the slaves were merely flesh, dehumanizing them to the point where they were. The notion that the slaves were merely flesh, dehumanizing them to a point where there was close to no sympathy for the horrors occurring. This led slaves to do whatever it took to liberate themselves, and they tried everything, but Black on Both Sides really focuses on the cross-dressing and fungibility as a maneuver to escape the white man's grasp.
Segment 3. What is revealed through this approach that otherwise would be obfuscated and hazy in the study of history? From my perspective, transgender has been revealed for a while, from almost the beginning of life or from centuries ago. But here we are focusing more on the 19th century. Based on Son Norton's book, Black on Both Sides, some doctors, like Dr. Sims in the 19th century, did start by doing sexual transformative surgeries on Black people. In addition, choosing Black people for doing medical experiments had a reason, because they knew if a Black or a slave dies from that experimental surgery, the doctors will not be investigated about it. However, the life of Black people had no value as the white saw them. Slaves can be replaced by any other slave. This was merciless and inhuman. Also, that's why slaves were oppressed in the past.
Conclusively, Black on Both Sides brings a new light to transgender and queerness that would otherwise be obfuscated in our current society because of how prominent these practices are. What this book is really proposing is that these ideas have been around for centuries, and that modern thinking is a reflection of the white slave owners of the past. In fear of time becoming more cyclical, this book's intent is to expose people to a wider perspective on the previously stated ideas, so that we can become more progressive as a whole.